These are the introduction notes to cell respiration. We're going to kind of introduce the rules of cell respiration and all of the characters or the pieces. So if cell respiration is the game, these are kind of, it's like the intro instruction booklet that we're going to do in this video. So I'm going to go ahead and start. Hold on, let me turn off that sound. That sound's going to get annoying. All right. Pointer, excuse me for 1 second. All right, so the whole point of cell respiration is to make energy, right? And in terms of biological systems, energy is ATP, right? So that really is the whole point. Everything else is just an ends to the mean, or a means to the end of making ATP. This is going to occur, at least in eukaryotic organisms or cells, this is going to occur in the mitochondria. So remember that from endosymbiosis, or the theory of endosymbiosis, we've figured out that these structures are actually derived and evolved from prokaryotic cells. Some of the evidence for this is that they actually have their own ribosomes, and they are the same type of ribosomes, the 70S ribosomes that bacteria have. They also have their own DNA, they have the double membrane, and actually the inside of that membrane, that double membrane, is where we're going to focus most of our attention when we talk about cell respiration. If you look at ATP itself, remember that evolution is going to basically modify things if it can, rather than build things from scratch. So ATP is actually a modified nucleotide. Remember, it's an adenine, a ribose sugar, and phosphate with these kind of 2 extra added phosphates on the end. And it's that third phosphate, once we've spring-loaded this molecule, that really stores most of the energy between the bonds on this oxygen in this second and third phosphorus, this phosphate group. All right, so the whole point is that we're essentially going to be moving electrons, right? And every time you eat food, you're basically consuming electrons. This is the whole point of eating and storing energy. Remember that we talked about energy as not being this kind of mythical force. It's really just the movement of electrons. So we're going to track the movement of electrons throughout this entire system. When you eat things like fats and proteins, because remember, we have to build molecules. You're going to break things down and then build them back up again. You have this energy coupling of catabolistic reactions and anabolistic reactions. So the fats and the proteins you eat are really going to provide most of the raw materials for this system. Whereas the carbohydrates, and the main carbohydrate here is glucose, which we'll see, is really going to provide the fuel, the energy for running this reaction. Right. So there are all those little cute pictures. The whole point is that you're taking up these carbs, fats, and proteins, breaking them down, building them back up. Fats and proteins are your raw materials, and carbs really are going to be the main fuel for these reactions. Of all the carbs, glucose is the most preferred. If it's present, your cells will actually use it first. And this is probably why it's difficult for a lot of people to lose some weight, because when we increase our sugar uptake, we're burning the glucose rather than the stored fats. So you have to watch that. But glucose is the molecule your body wants to use if it's present. And we are going to break glucose down. Remember, glucose is an energy-rich molecule. There are a lot of hydrogen-carbon bonds in glucose. So we're going to run a catabolistic reaction, a catabolism, to produce our energy molecule, ATP. Right, so we're going to take glucose. We're essentially going to burn it with oxygen. Remember, glucose is the high energy molecule. We're going to get ATP out of this. Right, that is our form of energy. Oops. Oh, messed that up. How did I? Hold on, give me 1 second. My screen got all kind of funky here. There we go. All right, had a little tech malfunction. Welcome to behind the scenes problems. All right, there we go. So we're going to get our ATP molecules, our energy. We're going to make quite a lot of those. We're going to make water, and I'll show you how. Carbon dioxide, and we are going to release some excess heat because all energy transfer is not totally perfect. This is second law of thermodynamics. You are going to lose energy. In this case, is heat. So one way to think about this is just to compare what you might think of in chemistry, just a typical combustion reaction. You have fuel. Remember that carbohydrates, wood is just carbohydrates, right? It's just a whole bunch of glucoses. It's cellulose, right? Linked all together. So all these glucoses has cellulose, and the fire is going to be like the activation energy. And we are going to produce in this reaction using oxygen, once we burn the cellulose, carbon dioxide, water, and heat energy. Right? This is just a typical combustion reaction that you learned about in chemistry. The same basic thing is happening in cell respiration, right? We're not burning wood, but we are burning links of glucose, or I guess once you've broken it down into its monomers, individual glucoses, right? So the fuel is the same. We're going to use oxygen, just like you would in a combustion reaction, and we're going to produce ATP, again, that's the whole point, and a little bit of heat. So it's essentially the exact same reaction. You have the same products, you have the same substrates, and you produce energy. So how do we harvest energy from the fuel that we eat? How are we going to get energy from, in this case, glucose and other carbs, right? And when we talk about harvesting energy, we just have to remember that energy is electrons. Whichever molecules have the electrons have the energy. Right? So to keep track of energy, we keep track of electrons. And remember that every time you break a bond, you are releasing electrons. And that's what we're doing here. This is a catabolic reaction. We're breaking off electrons from glucose, and we're moving them elsewhere. This is the whole point, right? We have to carry or move and carry electrons around. We can move that energy. So when you do this, and you'll recognize this from chemistry last year or the year before, this is just a redox reaction. So if you have this yellow molecule down here that is losing an electron and is transferring it over to this blue molecule, right? This yellow molecule loses it, the blue molecule gains it. We say that the yellow molecule, in this case, which now has a slightly positive, or not a slightly positive charge, it has a full positive charge, has become oxidized. And the molecule that gained the electron, its charge gets reduced. It has an extra negative charge, so its charge total is reduced. This is the redox reaction, a reduction-oxidation reaction. And the yellow molecule has lost energy because it has lost an electron, and the blue molecule has gained energy. It has gained an electron. Remember, wherever the energy or wherever the electron goes, so goes the energy, right? And this is all we're going to do when we talk about cell respiration. We're going to continually oxidize and reduce molecules. And we're going to basically, it's a game of pass the electrons around. And we're going to start with glucose. That's where the energy molecules come from. That's where the electrons come from. And we'll see which molecules get the electrons at the very end of this hot potato game of passing around the electrons. All right, so here's where all these things kind of start to come together. At the top, I'm just going to write a couple reminders. I'll write them over here on the side. Remember, electrons equal energy. Wherever the electrons are, that's where the energy is. And I want you to also remember what a hydrogen is. Remember, a hydrogen atom is just a proton. There's no neutrons here. And one electron. Remember, that's all a hydrogen is. And I also want you to remember that in your body, you have a concentration of hydrogens. You have a pH of roughly 7, which means you have a concentration of 10 to the negative 7 molar of, in this case, protons in your body, in your cytoplasm, etc. So let's go ahead and look at this redox reaction and see where this comes into play. Remember, we're releasing energy, electrons, and we're going to get a lot of that energy from breaking bonds. Remember, whenever you break a bond, you release electrons. Because glucose has so many carbon-carbon-carbon hydrogen bonds, remember, it's a big chunky molecule, it's an excellent source of electrons and therefore an excellent source of energy. We're going to take off these electrons by stripping them from the carbon-hydrogen bonds, which is another way of saying we're going to oxidize glucose. Remember, every time we remove an electron, we're oxidizing that molecule. Since we are removing electrons from glucose, we're going to oxidize it. We're going to oxidize it. So imagine that you're snapping all of these carbon-hydrogen bonds in glucose. You're ripping apart poor little glucose, and you are releasing all of these electrons that were from these carbon-hydrogen bonds. What's getting reduced? We're oxidizing glucose, but where are these electrons going? They're not just going to float around the cell. They're going to be immediately attracted to electronegative atoms, right? So what's the most electronegative atom in high quantities in an organism? That atom is oxygen. It's oxygen, right? So in biology and in living systems, the most prevalent and highly electronegative atom is an oxygen atom. So oxygen is going to be the recipient of all these electrons in this game of hot potato, or hot electron, right? So we are going to reduce oxygen. Oxygen is going to gain the electrons. So if you're looking at this and you're saying, okay, O2 is going to water, how do we get the water, right? If here's our oxygen atom, how do we get water out of oxygen? Well, here's how. Remember that oxygen can handle 2 electrons. So all of these electrons that are getting broken off of these carbon-hydrogen bonds are going to make their way over to the nearest electronegative thing, in which case is going to be oxygen. Oxygen can handle 2 electrons. I'm actually going to redraw this over here. So I'm going to redraw this oxygen over here on the left. Well, going back to our pH and that we have protons in a concentration in our cytoplasm, these protons are going to say, ooh, looky over here. There's a negative charge on this oxygen. I'm going to join up with it. And each oxygen can do this twice. And at this point, what do you have? What is a proton and an electron? That's just a hydrogen. What do you have over here? The same thing. A proton and an electron is just a hydrogen. So what molecule did we make? We made water, right? So because oxygen is so electronegative, it attracts the electrons getting broken and released by the carbon-hydrogen bonds and glucose that then in turn attract protons. You actually get water molecules. And this is actually the whole point of oxygen. The only reason we need oxygen in our bodies is to serve as an electron carrier, to be a super electronegative atom that gets reduced into water. That's it. So overall, we're releasing electrons stored in the bonds of glucose, which oxidizes it into, in this case, carbon dioxide. And we're passing on those electrons to oxygen. But because those electrons attract protons, you end up building water, and then you get ATP. So that's kind of the big picture. I'm going to skip this slide really quick. This is our kind of last rule book slide. What's actually happening with these electrons? Because they don't kind of just move around willy-nilly and float around. They don't diffuse for too terribly long before they bump into something that's going to carry them, right? So our last player here in this game of cell respiration are two other electron carriers, right? So we've already talked about the big boy. Oxygen is obviously an electron carrier. It can handle two of them. But there are two other carriers that we need to talk about. And those carriers are called NAD and FAD, NAD plus and FAD2 plus. And if you look at NAD really quick, which is what's down here, you'll see that it is just a modified nucleotide, right? It's a modified nucleotide, which is something that you should get used to seeing. These are not completely new molecules. These are just modified existing structures. And you'll notice there's a nitrogen with a positive charge right there, right? That means when you're breaking electrons, and those electrons are in the mitochondria, some are going to oxygen, some are going to go to NAD and FAD, because they also are electronegative. Not quite as electronegative as oxygen, but they're electronegative. Those positive charges attract an electron, right? And the proton and the electron, just as we talked about on the last slide, is just a hydrogen, right? So this is where the hydrogen comes from. We've reduced NAD plus into NADH. That's just a reduction reaction. So there it is. There's the hydrogen atom that we've attached from reducing this. You can go in the opposite direction too. If you remove the hydrogen or you remove the electron and the proton follows it, you've oxidized it. So you can load this carrier. It's kind of like a school bus for electrons. You can load them on, and then you can take them back off, and you can empty the school bus back out. Right. So these are your electron carriers. And actually, it's vitamin B3. I forgot to tell you this. It was right there the whole time. But vitamin B3 is NAD. It is an electron carrier. This is one of the reasons why you need to take your vitamins, because if you don't have enough vitamin B3, you're basically missing your electron school buses. You don't have enough vehicles to carry around electrons. So take your vitamins. Also remember that because these molecules are getting reduced and they are carrying electrons, they are going to be high in energy. Remember, he who has the electrons has the energy. These are high energy molecules. And the last thing I'm going to leave you with on this slide is that hopefully by now, what you've basically seen is that it's difficult to track the movement of electrons themselves, because in a molecule, you really don't see electrons. What you see is a hydrogen. So as a proxy, kind of as a way to track the movement of electrons, you're basically just going to be looking for hydrogens, because the proton is attracted to the electron and the two of them put together make the hydrogen. So if you're ever tracking the movement of electrons, it is so much easier to follow the hydrogen. You're like, oh, there's a missing hydrogen in NAD+, and then it shows up in NADH. Energy and the electron must therefore have moved from NAD+ to NADH. You're just following the hydrogen to tell you where the energy has gone. So those are the rules, those are the players. This is the game. All right, we're going to go through 3 steps of this game in our next video. The first step is called glycolysis. And kind of over here in this picture, this is basically just a cell with a huge mitochondria in it. This is just a cell. We're actually going to start this game outside the cytoplasm, outside the mitochondria in the cytoplasm. And what we're going to do is we're going to take glucose, and we're going to oxidize it into pyruvate. And we do this without oxygen. This is called anaerobic, and we'll talk about that later. But then what happens is pyruvate will actually move into the mitochondria. This is the first time the mitochondria actually comes into play, right? Into something called the Krebs cycle. We'll walk through what happens to pyruvate once we're in the Krebs cycle, but the point is, these two steps do make a little bit of ATP. You actually get 2 ATP from glycolysis, and you get 2 ATP from the Krebs cycle. So you do get a little bit of energy, but it's honestly not that much. Glucose is a 6-carbon sugar, and pyruvate is a 3-carbon sugar, so you actually make 2 pyruvates, because you're going to conserve matter. You're not going to just have carbons disappear. And again, it's the pyruvates that actually move into the mitochondria. Out of the Krebs cycle, you're also going to get these electron carriers that we talked about. NAD plus is going to get reduced to NADH, and FAD2 plus gets reduced to FADH2. And again, keep track of the electrons by keeping track of the hydrogens, right? So you're like, oh, there's a hydrogen, it must have been reduced, it must have more energy because it has an electron. Oh, FAD got reduced to FADH2, it must have gotten 2 electrons and it must have more energy now. These molecules are then going to move to the electron transport chain, where they drop off their electrons to oxygen, and you produce an additional 32 ATP. This is the big payoff. This is where most of the ATP comes from. Details in the next video, and I will see you there.